Welcome to the Artist Equity Speaker Series. My name is Karen Cappy-Nugent, and on the call with us today is my co-chair, Betsy Miraglia. Many thanks to her and to all on the AE board who made this series possible, especially Robin Stone, AE president. A very warm welcome to Emma Wilcox. Emma is co-founder of Gallery Aferro along with Evonne Davis. Unfortunately, Evonne had some family emergencies this week and is unable to join us today. Emma, could you please let Evonne know we wish all well?
Thank you, I will.
We're thrilled to have you here, Emma. Emma is joining us to talk about founding and operating a gallery and residency. A little bit about today's format. I'll ask Emma to do an introduction, and then we'll get into a deeper discussion around the topic for today. Towards the end, for the last 15 or 20 minutes or so, we'll open the floor to a Q&A period. So you could be posting things in the chat as the discussion is happening, and we'll touch base on them towards the end of our time together. So Emma, to get started, would you like to introduce yourself and then share maybe why Gallery Aferro was founded and a little more about it? And of course, we have your slides, so I'll wait for your direction.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. And why don't we kick it off with the first slide?
Oops, I went too far.
Okay, so I am a working artist. And as you heard, I'm the co-founder of Gallery Aferro. I get to share this space with you today and anyone who's watching this later as a recording because almost 20 years ago with Evonne Davis, another young artist, we started an alternative art space that we ended up calling Gallery Aferro. So I always want to think about the nature of qualifications or perceived expertise, what is now called thought leadership. So I always try to start with, why do I get to share space with you? It's because I did this thing with another young artist almost 20 years ago. And starting the gallery at the age of 22, if you want to go to the next slide, it was a little bit like joining a band or the army or running away to join the circus. It was a total commitment to a way of life. And so everything that's happened since has essentially been learning in public. So those are my qualifications to speak to you, is lived experience and learning by doing, and learning in community and learning in public. So 2 decades is really old in alternative art space years. If you want to go to the next slide. It's not quite ancient, but alternative art spaces, what are now called artist-centered spaces, are often quite fragile. 5 or 10 years is a pretty good run. And you have to think about some of these closures or disillusions. They're very natural, they're very organic. Other times they're really quite tragic. So with almost 2 decades in, there's a lot that I can talk about from a place of very deep pragmatism. That's about building something that endures and lasts. But I'm at a very reflective place about a lot of things with these 2 decades under my belt. And it's never mine solely. If you want to talk about the idea of who is speaking, most of this work that I'm going to be talking about today, again, was done with Evonne, was done with community, in community. So there's always this kind of polyphonic voice to it. So if I say I, there's usually a kind of perceived plural in there. So I love getting into it and talking shop and talking strategy and being deeply pragmatic. But at this point, I'm at this very sort of idealistic and philosophical place with serving what this work has meant. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is what it means to do work a little bit ahead of or outside of the mainstream gaze, which is to say mainstream validation, what we kind of talk about as mainstream rubber stamping. and what it means to do work that in some ways you don't really have the language for, either because you haven't accessed it yet, or maybe it just doesn't really exist yet. Affero is working in a very long and proud tradition of alternative art spaces. I think at least in this country, it probably dates easily to the early 60s. But the present moment, the very, very present moment right now, where there's a lot of discussion about accessibility and equity, especially in gallery practices, we started Affero a little bit before all of that. So that's an interesting thing to think about. Even the notion of graduate programs in socially engaged practice, or calling yourself a culture worker, we didn't really have that language when we started doing what we were doing. I think Evonne and I worked from a very instinctive place, a place that was intuitive and informed by passion. And a lot of it was a passion for access and resources. That'll be just sort of a recurring theme in the next hour, is access and resources. And this image here is from my practice as an artist. I make long-term photographic projects using black and white silver gelatin imagery and text. And this is the roof of the first Gallery Aferro building with some alterations that I made. That building was taken from us by an eminent domain action, and it marked a real shift in my practice as a relatively young photographer. So the nature of my practice and the relationship of it to running the gallery, they have shifted, run alongside each other, merged a few times, come apart. So that's also, I think, a little bit of a theme today, is the nature of me and also me, working artist, gallery co-founder. But they're inextricably intertwined. So I wanted to have a callback to this very early image from my practice as a way of acknowledging those 2 decades. So if you want to go to the next slide. So my favorite part of these kinds of sessions is the Q&A, because it gives me a sense of, again, who I'm in community with, who I'm in the room with. And I'm jumping ahead here a little bit to a project that Gallery Aferro completed in, I think it was around 2015, for Newark's 350th anniversary. So we'll get back to that in a little bit. But when I talk about resources and access, what does that mean? So just close your eyes if you feel like it, and think about, what rooms do you feel welcome in? What spaces do you know how to access? And that doesn't have to be metaphorical. I mean, you know, go up to a door. Can you even figure out how to get in? Is the door locked? Do you know what the hours of operation are if it's a public space? And what spaces do you feel unwelcome in? What spaces are memorable? What spaces do you know the rules? What spaces do you know how to break the rules or access the possibilities? And how many different kinds of resources can you conceptualize when you think about what you might need or want as a working artist over the course of your life? Especially because we were young starting the gallery, we were very sensitive, both Evonne and I, despite very different backgrounds, to this sort of the space that it's sort of a rupture. It's this rupture of access to resources that people so frequently experience, where if you are lucky enough to have had access to you know, build your skills and express yourself creatively, you know, that usually comes in some kind of institutional setting, like a school, you know, a lab, a textile room, any kind of media specific art space. It's got equipment, it's got resources, it's got space, supplies possibly. And at some point, maybe when you graduate from art school or otherwise leave, that access gets cut off and you have to sort of rebuild your world. You don't just see it in very young people, though. A lot of times with working adults, older adults that we've met in Newark, they might have had this very brief and very potent moment in their lives when they had access to some kind of art-related resources, maybe in like a creative vocational setting. Newark once had a very well-known facility like that. And then something happens and that moment is over. Maybe it was a moment in their lives when they could afford to take classes, but there's this rupture and you want to sort of get back to that place. So none of this is an abstraction. This is all very real, very lived, almost bodily experience. And when I think about the kind of work that we wanted to do on just the most instinctive and passionate level, I just always come back to that. You know, how do you find the resources to do your work? And in what spaces do you feel welcome in? What spaces do you feel like you can claim as being for you? And I think we were thinking about our families and people we knew, but over the years, we would meet hundreds, if not thousands of people where we could see again and again that dynamic. I'll never forget the night I was working very late at the gallery. I think I might have been sweeping the floor, I'm not really sure. And there was this knock on the door, it was raining. And an older gentleman was knocking at the glass of the door. And he had seen the lights on and seen that we had some kind of art space. And he wanted to know if we had any kind of silk screening facilities. And I invited him in, and he was describing being able to take some very basic printmaking courses before he ended up getting conscripted to go off to Vietnam. And so what does this mean? This is not really just about printmaking. This is about getting back in touch with that part of yourself, with that younger person, and trying to, in some ways, reconnect with them. So, you know, the language of arts nonprofits can get very kind of dry and abstracted. You know, talk about, you know, community asset mapping and, you know, different kinds of arts facilities. But when I think about the work, I think about that man. I think about what it means to have access to a creatively expressive life.
I want to just insert there. So it sounds like that's where you get your superpower from, your empathy for that experience. Anyway, please continue.
Of course. So the thing about doing the work and learning in public is that you even have to start with, what does it mean to be an alternative space? So I joke with students a lot. I say Affero is not a status quo space. There's kind of a perceived push. There's something to struggle against. There's something that we are implicitly or overtly reacting and pushing back against. But you have to define what you are in opposition to, whether you're trying to create a little corner of the world as you wish that it was, or you are trying to fill a perceived vacuum, something that doesn't exist, some kind of link that you wish was there. So Martha Rosler, who is a pretty extraordinary artist and thinker, has very famously talked about the functioning of arts alternative spaces towards the end of the 20th century and into the early 21st as what she calls the foyer. And she has this critique where she talks about the idea of an alternative space as really sort of a catchment basin or a pre-processing facility to sort out artists who likely have promising commercial futures. So that is one interpretation of being an alternative space, is essentially a sort of processing facility for the commercial art world. I'm sure you can tell I don't particularly embrace that role of an alternative space, but I also absolutely refuse to traffic in some kind of perceived binary of, you know, the more sort of avant-garde, or potentially even, the binary gets really weird here, avant-garde / commercially viable fine artist and the regional community artist. I absolutely refuse to traffic in that binary either. So a lot of what Affero is a lot of things and different things to different people. So in the past 20 years, we have run continuously a artist workspace residency program, and it is open 24/7, 365 days a year. So sometimes when I count out all the minutes and hours of time that artists have spent in the studio at every moment of day and night, it's really kind of extraordinary. We have offered at this point probably thousands of exhibitions, a very wide range of public events, including film screenings, poetry readings, all kinds of educational workshops. We have a publication line of more than 24 different kinds of publications. We have a community reading room, and we have 3 permanent interactive installations, 2 of which are payphones, one of which is a vintage elevator, and that lets us work with sound art. We have done public art initiatives. We have done a wide range of educational offerings, including our internship program, which pairs young people with the working artists in our residency program. And recently of late, we have been doing a lot of projects that a little bit defy description. And we've been doing a lot of what is now called legacy work, memory work, work that is about intergenerational knowledge exchange and acknowledging and working with in service to elders in our community. So the kind of work that we do continues to sort of evolve and mutate and hybridize. And I think that's how it should be, because again, if you really are an alternative space, you have to, figure out, what are you reacting to? What are you pushing against? And when Affero turned 15, we were thinking about, what is it really? It's more than some dry recitation of an endless series of programs, as much as I'm tremendously proud of the sheer volume and variety of them. So this is what I wrote down. Gallery Aferro is beyond anything else, beyond the details of any particular program, the manifestation of a daily practice of love, a kind of stubborn love wherein a group of ordinary working people claim some physical and intellectual territory and hold it as far apart as we can, with constant effort from the forces of extractive capitalism and from the forces of repression and backlash that rise up over and over again in American history. So there you go. It's a stubborn kind of love. So the Affero Mobile Portrait Studio definitely falls under the projects that defy description category, because in some ways it encapsulates a little bit our deep origins, our earliest efforts, and also allowed us to draw upon the just incredible rich tapestry of relationships that we had built over time. Because as much as I talk about Affero needing to evolve all the time and mutate and change form, I think that there is a kind of radicalism sometimes inherent, especially in certain communities like Newark. There's a kind of radicalism inherent in making a commitment, in the constancy of commitment, that kind of reciprocal trust that you can build with your community when you just day in and day out keep opening the door and turning on the lights, and you posit yourself as a constant. So the Mobile Portrait Studio was a fully functioning professional photographic portrait studio run out of a cargo trailer. And our original aim was at various public venues to photograph 350 Newark residents for Newark's 350th anniversary. And I would say about 2 years later, the project was still running due to popular demand. And we had photographed thousands of people and given them free portraits. And it was an incredibly transformative experience for me personally, because it was this sort of absolute submission to the joy of being in public and being in community. We had to completely abandon any kind of conventional project timeline. There was this initial plan, you go to one site in the East Ward and another site in the West Ward, and it's all mapped out and there's dates and plans. And something completely different happened. We just got passed along through this sort of constant tide of public interest, where one group would recommend us with that compact, with that trust. They would say, this was really great. Would you like to come to my church? Would you like to come to the house party? Would you like to come to my faith-based tradition that we have in the park every year? Do you want to photograph my double Dutch team? And so a couple times we probably did 4 or 5 portrait days in 1 week. It was quite exhausting, but it was absolutely glorious because we knew that what we were doing was genuinely wanted and that it was taking on the form that it was supposed to. It was just a really extraordinary experience. If you want to go to the next slide. There we go. So this is just one of the thousands of portraits that we're able to create. And each one of the subjects owns the rights to their image. They get high resolution images when they get photographed, and Affero retains sort of limited usage for this kind of purpose, promoting the project. And I think in the end, like all projects, it sort of takes on meaning over time, because you can imagine this kind of shared visual civic archive. I want to revisit these portraits 50 years from now. What will they mean? So it definitely encompassed a lot of our interest in the beginning and imagining that Affero might be a mobile project. And of course, the obsession with resources and access. But the success of the project wouldn't have been possible if we hadn't been in the same community at that time for so many years. It takes time to build up that kind of trust. It takes time to build up those relationships. So it was really sort of a culmination of a lot of the different things that we had learned over time. I want to shout out to my partner, Evonne, who couldn't be on this call, because again, there's a kind of language, this kind of language that comes because art always institutionalizes itself. There is this very kind of dry arts nonprofit language that is very prevalent in the sector, where you almost start to talk about the community, whether it's an artist community or another community of people, and it's very much the language of power dynamics. There's a client being served, and so reflecting on that, Evonne said to me once, art is not going to save us. It is going to make us worth saving. And I just want to sit with that for a few minutes. It's really interesting speaking to you today, thinking about what it might mean to be, say, an artist membership organization like Arts Equity. Because again, these forms arise out of a perceived need. They're always in reaction to something. So when I look at the tri-state area, I see an enormous amount of membership-based artist organizations that, as best I can tell, in some cases even date to a 1920s or 30s kind of consciousness, sometimes even earlier. The idea of a guild of skilled professionals with like interests was very powerful, was very potent. If you think about the Artists League of New York, you can see that form. You can see that very potent artist organizing form. But you have to remember the landscape is always shifting. What I also see in my home state of New Jersey is a lot of kind of legacy organizations where a younger generation of artists doesn't necessarily relate to the idea of the membership format. It's not always perceived as being sort of part of that legacy of organizing and sort of building power in a group. So there's always this sort of shift, this sea of perception and the sense of what form is needed. So when I think about Affero's origins, I think Evonne and I were conceptualizing something in the beginning that vaguely resembles a kind of a workers' co-op, again, and just in the most instinctive and intuitive way. And Affero ended up, in terms of its legal form, being a fairly conventional 501c3. It is not a workers' co-op. You know, I have terrible insomnia. So at night, when I can't sleep, I will often read the history of intentional communities, anywhere between the 19th to the 20th century. And I'm struck by just these recurring tides of people, often creative people, often very passionate and idealistic people, trying to come together and get something done. And whether it be an artist community or a group of shakers or a group of hippies or punks or squatters, anyone who's ever tried to do anything with more than 3 people will recognize some of these factors in play. Who is great at articulating the soundbite, who remembers to sweep the floor. It just happens over and over and over again. And there's a lot of humor in these narratives of trying to come together and be stronger in a group. So this is something I think about a lot, especially with the function of Affero as a residency program. We're a non-residential, a workspace only space, but in some ways there's nothing more intimate than having artists work together in one building over an extended period of time. You see emergence stories, you see re-emergence stories. People surprise you, people don't surprise you. It is absolutely astonishing. And it's one of the best parts of my work, I have to say. How are we doing on time?
We have a good 10 more minutes. So yeah.
Excellent. So if you want to go to the next slide. There we go. So one of my favorite things when I'm talking with people I don't know about the experience of founding and then sustaining over time something like Gallery Aferro is I always Google Gallery Aferro and I take a screenshot of whatever the image results are that day. And again, it's this kind of sea of images. It's constantly shifting. It's never fixed. You see all of this meaning, all of these moments. Some of them are very intimate. They happen between maybe one person and a piece of artwork or 2 people. Some of them are, you know, about being in a big raucous crowd of hundreds of people and having a kind of shared experience together. But that's what it all comes down to. It's all just moments. And then they add up to something that is so much larger. So it's never the same. And it's a kind of Buddhist reminder to me, because maybe I'm more impressed by the Google image results a year ago, but I always share whatever I find that day, the day that I'm going to be speaking, because it's never fixed. It's always shifting. So I haven't spoken a great deal about the part of my life that is that of a working artist. And I think it might be interesting to say, in the time that I have now, that the question of how to balance the 2 roles, it's a very regular question for both Evonne and myself. And there is an incredible amount of sort of implicit pressure on people who have a title like ED to not tell the truth, to say, oh, I've got it completely balanced. You know, my creative practice is completely flourishing, as is my organization. And I really want to tell the truth. And the truth is, it's complicated. The truth is, doing something like Affero brings my whole self, my whole creative self to the table. And in some ways, there is nothing more fulfilling. I think about all of these moments that I've had the opportunity to connect with other people in a way that I would never have been able to if I hadn't been part of starting something like Affero. This kind of work forces you to be so much more than the sum of your lived experience. So in some ways, I am so much more for having started something like Gallery Aferro. In other ways, I am less, because you bring your whole self to the work. So I think if there's anyone on this call who has been an ED or a founder, I would like to perhaps encourage a more open conversation about this topic, because folks who have mentored me and folks who I have seen speak later in private, they'll tell you it's complicated. So it might be time to have these conversations in public. So one of the things about my practice is, like I told you, I work in black and white and I make long-term projects. And I have largely made work in and around about a 5-mile radius of Newark, almost exclusively at or near night, on foot, with the exception of work made via helicopter. And my work is concerned with contested sites, with environmental justice, land usage, eminent domain, and broadly the role of individual memory in the creation of local history. But again, my work with Affero has so completely transformed and informed my practice. One of the things that working in Newark and working from the vantage point of Gallery Aferro has taught me is about how the more recent past is a vastly less pliable narrative. So the power dynamics are different. If you work with the more recent past, I mean, putting it very bluntly, there's more people around to argue with you and tell you that you got it wrong. So the idea of sort of who is considered a reliable narrator when it comes to narrating the history of a place, the work that I do with elders at Affero, the work that we do to try to combat erasure, especially on the axes of race or class or gender, that work absolutely feeds my personal practice. It has taught me so much. So they are profoundly and sort of inextricably linked in a variety of ways. So what is an alternative space? Really, it can be a lot of things. When I think about what Affero is, I sometimes think about it as a context. I think about it as a conduit, a connection. It's different things to different people. And the other day, I came across this quote by late poet Lucille Clifton. And, you know, like so many really smart things, it's very brief. And she said, "For me, poetry is a way of living in the world. For me, poetry is a way of trying to express something that is very difficult to express. And it's a way of trying to come to peace with the world." And I would say, I speak for only myself. The work that we do is always with people and in community. It's not really solo work, but I speak only for myself when I say that Affero has, for me, been a way of living in the world. All right, so let's get into it. Are there questions?
Yeah, I have some questions. I'm very much intrigued. My question is, what were you reacting to when you developed Affero, and what unites your members? What unites the artists that participate in your organization?
Oh, those are great questions. Okay, so let's see. If you had asked me that question 10 years ago, I might have given you a slightly different answer. But when I go all the way back to the very beginning, I don't think the motivations have changed. It's just that I've gotten better language for expressing them to others. So at 22, all that I knew was that I had been lucky enough to go to art school on scholarship, but it was abundantly clear that there were vastly more creative people wandering around the world than the people who felt comfortable in galleries and museums. There's no need to be any less blunt about it. And that struck me as being deeply unfair. And as a young artist, I was very concerned and really confused by, more than anything else, sort of confused, later enraged, but at the time mainly confused by the sense that the avant-garde of all things seemed to belong to people who had trust funds or participated in various forms of assertive mating. And it didn't make any sense to me. I wanted to play with ideas in public and really sort of push boundaries. And it seemed very perverse that experimental art for art's sake seemed to belong to the privileged class. So I was sort of smacking up against a dynamic that has been with us for centuries. So that's sort of where I was as a young person, but a really wonderful transformative moment for me, maybe about 10 years into Gallery Aferro, was discovering the work of women who founded an organization in New York City called Cool Culture, which was primarily concerned with connecting Head Start families with free access to museums and other cultural sites in the city and the boroughs. And their framework for trying to make those connections was basically on the axis of three kinds of barriers. And a big part of dealing with trying to change the world, right, is you have to sort of articulate what's going on first. So the three barriers are financial barriers, logistical barriers, and perceptual barriers. And I have never come across anything so accurate and so helpful in terms of approaching the sort of gulf between the world as it is and maybe the world as we want it to be. It's really hard work, though. The financial barriers and even sometimes the logistical barriers are child's play compared with perceptual barriers. Perceptual barriers are the beast. They are the thing you will be wrestling with forever. And they are also the thing that makes the work worth doing. So interestingly, again, I didn't have this kind of language when we started. And this language really comes to us from essentially radical museum educators. It took me about 10 years into Affero to realize in some ways they were my people. And it's worth noting that these are usually the folks who most closely resemble the communities in which a given museum is located. And they're usually the people with the least job security and the first people let go. That was definitely true in 2020. And it's worth noting in passing. So that's sort of part one. I tend to think in big baggy paragraphs. So part two is also a really fantastic question. So we are not strictly speaking a membership organization, but that's just semantics. I mean, it's a community for sure. There is great power and meaning to the idea of having come through the Affero residency program. At this point, the residency functions as both a heavily subsidized workspace studio program, and it also has two different fellowships connected with it. One fellowship is for women artists of color. The other fellowship is for artists who are parents. And with both of those kind of parts of the residency program, it's really important to acknowledge the function of being an alumni. It's not something that ends after you have given back the keys and you no longer have a studio in the building. So it's not really a stable though either. The idea of a stable of artists is something we get from the commercial world. I would say it's kind of a loose association, and there's great power in it as this kind of network that you can access over time. And I would say, you know, it's an incredibly diverse group in terms of things like media, temperament, age, and so many other factors. It's also an increasingly regional and even global network of people. So I think it's interesting how people connect and reconnect over time. So I think perhaps the most important factor here is that idea of time, that we're in it for the long run with people. we're interested in you, not just if you are clearly on an upward commercial trajectory. We're interested in the whole story, whatever that looks like over time, whatever you are wrestling with in this moment. We're interested, and we want to know what you're wrestling with 20 years from now.
Very interesting. So you kind of undefined, but that's kind of what draws people to you. Would that be fair? Except for art and community, is that right?
So interestingly, as should not come as too much of a surprise to anyone who's stayed with me on this call so far, we have a lot of folks in the building whose practice is in some way socially engaged, connected with topical issues, often infused with some kind of humanities interest. We have a lot of folks connected with Affero whose work is site-specific, interdisciplinary, experimental, ephemeral, even performative. But something that was said to us repeatedly, especially by artists of color working with us in the program, is the real freedom is getting to make art about whatever you want. So the expectation of making work that's on a particular set of social issues can in and of itself become a kind of, limitation or barrier or something that's imposed on you by gatekeepers. So there's a lot of power in sort of refusing to narrowly define. It makes my life as a grant writer quite difficult because we at times seem so amorphous. But there's great power there in terms of what it leaves people able to do.
So it kind of lets people define themselves. Is that more, it's kind of like more of a journey and a process of identifying yourself as an artist within community, as opposed to doing it the prescribed way or taking on a mindset that maybe doesn't belong to you in order to move forward. Is that what you're kind of saying? I think I'm kind of getting it. I think I'm used to taking on a mindset.
Yeah, no, we inherit these binaries, and we then, use them to sort of describe the world. Like creative people's aspirations vary wildly. Some people have profoundly commercial aspirations, and their work is well suited for that life. Some people do not. And even the whole notion of, emerging artist. Mel Chin has very famously described himself as a submerging artist. Even the whole notion of this kind of prescribed trajectory, where you're either, it's hilarious, where you're either like in the wings, you're on an upward trajectory, or you failed. I would say, and again, at this point in my life, I'm a very deeply pragmatic person. I'm not about, not describing things accurately, but these binaries are incredibly problematic. What about people who spend their entire lives outside of the sort of mainstream gaze? What do they get after they're dead? Maybe a BuzzFeed article. You've never heard of this artist, but they spent 30 years in a basement making these sculptures. Is that really what we want?
No.
There's been a flurry of high profile features of older women artists, frequently artists of color, but not exclusively, getting their first retrospectives at the age of 70 or 80 or 90 or 100. There was a very famous article in the Times, old women artists are the darlings of the art world. And I just about screamed and shredded the paper. Yeah, I mean, stay with me now. Because there was this incredible sort of passive voice in use in this article where I have so much joy about these women's success, but acting as if there weren't structural forces in play that caused these women's first retrospective to happen so late in life is offensive. It's letting institutions off the hook. It's not by accident. These women weren't waiting to be discovered. They probably would have liked their retrospectives earlier. In fact, our dear friend Gladys Barker Grauer, whose estate Gallery Aferro steward's, she passed away at the age of 97, and she once confided to us privately. She said, "I'm really excited about all the attention and I'm very grateful for it. I just wish that it happened sooner." What more can I say?
Yeah,
All right, who else?
awesome.
This has been terrific. This is Alice. I admire you so much for what you're doing for merging art and community and really building people up. It's wonderful. Keep at it. I'm
Thank
sure
you.
you will.
No,
How did you get, this is a sort of, Karen, how did you guys get together? How did we find you?
Research.
Good research. Thank you. Thank you for doing this.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Any other questions before I put one or two out there? Anybody else?
Can I just make a comment on that last question? When I first joined the board, we talked about building membership, and our president was new. So she wanted to chat with us for 15 minutes. So I wrote her a letter saying the things that I thought as a board member I could bring to the board to maybe help build membership and grow things a little. So I sat down and I looked for 8 different types of topics and places and artists and things that people were doing. And I think we have a really good cross-section of activities for people to benefit from listening to. This was one of them. I was looking for an organization within the tri-state area that worked with community. And you were one, and there was another one in Delaware. And when I listened to you when we interviewed, I knew we didn't make a mistake. We were, both Karen and I were fascinated with the whole thing. So I just hope, I think the hardest thing, I don't know if this is something you could figure out, how do we get this out to more of our membership? The value of these talks is just, to me, we have not been disappointed with, you're the third one. And
Well, let's talk about that at a marketing meeting.
at a marketing, oh,
Yeah.
oh no, I was thinking of Emma, how she works with community. And I wondered if there is a one-liner that you would have for reaching out to memberships to be more involved in, like you have in your place.
So everyone who knows me, the rest of the Affero team, if they ever see this, they will start screaming with laughter, because again, I'm not great at one-liners. I tend to kind of roll. So I have no easy prescriptives, but just hearkening back to this idea of how, as a young artist, when I started figuring out the sort of very progressive and potentially even kind of radical origins of artist membership organizations, and then contrasting them with many organizations in New Jersey who I, as you know, in my very early 20s, full of beans, thought of as being not necessarily terribly high functioning or exciting. These are the harsh judgments of youth, I would like to point out here. When I think about that, it's a constantly shifting landscape. So articulating value and making sure that you're not creating sort of duplicate content and trying to understand where there might be a perceived need. The problem is you have to sort of constantly assess the landscape that you're in. I actually find Philly's incredibly sort of large landscape of artist membership organizations just totally fascinating. You know, New Jersey has its own sort of landscape, and you know, something that's always troubled me about the landscape of my home state is per capita, we have very few museums, let alone specifically and exclusively visual arts museums. We have a kind of very strange relationship as a state with our cities. So those are some of the factors that you can look at. You know, New Jersey is where an incredible number of working parents who are working artists live, because we have this sort of sort of historic role as a bedroom community for people who may be employed throughout the tri-state. So these are some very unique factors in play when we sort of think about, what is most needed. And it's shifted a lot. Affero at this point is old enough as a Newark-based organization, as a New Jersey-based organization. We are currently Newark's oldest still operational artist-run space. So I would say that's like a very specific and interesting role for us to play. We're right in the middle, which of course is incredibly appropriate. Evonne and I are both Gen Xers, so we're sort of right in the middle generationally as well as organizationally. We are old enough to remember a time when Newark had many more artist-founded organizations, and we're also in touch with sort of what the folks who are interning at Gallery Aferro are just starting to visit, maybe 7th and 8th graders. There's definitely a lot of frustration and angst about resources with the younger artists in the community. And it's really incredible for me because I remember how I felt very vividly, but I'm also sometimes, I'm seeing how there can be a very shallow view if you don't know the sort of long history of the creative community that you're part of. Another way of putting it is if you stay around long enough, someone will accuse you of being the man, and say that you're not in touch with the youngins. So it's a privilege, and it's a kind of really extraordinary space that we're in, where we're in touch with our elders and with our youngins. We're right in the middle. So New Jersey also, when we started Affero, had what we perceived as a very thin, very, very thin network of career development opportunities. In retrospect, what I see was there were more maybe a decade ago in some ways than there are now. One of the major losses in Newark has been the loss of Algira, Center for Contemporary Art, because they created a linkage between their professional development program for artists and a program that's still in existence being run by the Bronx Museum. So it was an incredibly powerful linkage because you could connect across states and across institutions. So there was almost a sort of successive series of basically like artist posses, people who had gone through both programs, Algira's and the Bronx Museums. So that was really pretty extraordinary. But again, I was young and full of beans. So at the time I thought, this is not enough. We need so much more. So Affero was instrumental in organizing an incredible amount of artist career development programs. Interestingly, now there's more of those kinds of workshops on topics that we perceived as being completely inaccessible. There's more of those workshops available in the state. So you don't want to create duplicate content, but there's always something missing. There's always the opportunities for linkage. It's just sometimes finding them. So I don't know if that was the most useful answer, but I think there's always something to give and to contribute. It's just figuring out, how to make those connections. Are they regional? Are they neighborhood based? Are they intergenerational? Where's the missed connection, essentially? But it's hard work.
I think that's the key. It's hard work. It's a lot of work. And we happen to be an all volunteer organization. So doing surveys, doing outreach, doesn't always get done. But with that said, let's take a moment to kind of wrap up what's happened here. This has been fantastic, Emma. We could go on and have 4 more sessions with you. I think just many questions. But what I'd like to do is give you what I think my 3 main points are as a takeaway for an entrepreneur who might want to begin something like Gallery Aferro in another community. And that is, 1, do sort of an annotated bibliography of what's out there so you understand other organizations and what they're doing, maybe. 2, be okay with uncertainty. a lot of the time. And 3, at any given point in time, you're assessing what's happening, what's going on in the landscape, and you're responding to that, as well as identifying what it is you're working against / working toward. I don't know, how might you wrap up 3 big points of what someone could take away from this? Maybe
Well,
similar?
thank you for that summation. Okay, so I feel like this is advice that works both for starting an organization, and forget I said organization, for starting an initiative, for starting a thing, for starting a coffee shop that publishes a broadside once a month, or, you know, a weekly performance series that promises it will run for 2 years and then cease to exist, or, you know, a knitting group that takes over an abandoned building and eventually starts teaching workshops. Like, whatever your thing is, or if the thing is just your practice, I feel like, so this piece of advice probably works for any of those impulses, which should be start archiving your work. That sounds so dry and boring, you know, that's the line that has people napping when I talk to undergraduates. But this is the most loving and sort of the expression of my rage against the world and the status quo. This is the most loving thing that I can possibly say to other creative people, is write down the titles of your work, document what you're doing. Even if you literally have to pawn something to hire a decent photographer for your ephemeral performance series, you know, make a cheap website and start writing down what you do, because invisibility and erasure are really powerful forces. I'm perhaps a little emotional on this topic at the moment because a lot of artists in the tri-state area had archives damaged after Hurricane Ida. So I'm just thinking about how fragile our lives are and how beautiful sort of memory and community are. So archiving can be an Excel spreadsheet, a notebook, a website, a something. But I think that's advice. It's like, start early and keep doing it. And it's probably one of the most important things you can do. And you're also telling your own story. You're creating your own sound bites. And there's a lot of power in that, in terms of sharing your narrative as well as controlling your narrative. There is, again, this very beautiful and powerful and rich history in Newark of arts and activism, but there's a little bit of a kind of documentation rupture between the time before the internet and the time after. And so it's a history that's in danger of being lost. And a lot of the sort of 80s, 90s, and early 2000s artist community history, it took place in legal or semi-legal buildings. And, you know, those buildings aren't really there anymore. So there's just this sense of wanting to make sure that these stories that live in people's heads and on their lips make it to some other archival format. And then the only other sort of thing that I might add to your amazing summation, something that I wish I had known earlier, is you can reserve the right to make your work as expansive or as limited and concise as you wish it to be. I think between the two of us, Evonne and I had and have so many different interests and a lot of energy, and also a big chip on our shoulders and something to prove. So Affero just kept growing and growing. It was like it couldn't get big enough. There couldn't be enough. We're both really interested in the idea of like abundance. And perhaps different people would have been able to sit with the work a little more easily and say, I'm going to do this as like a poetry series, and I'm going to do it sometimes, and I'm not going to always do it. But we just sort of didn't have it in us to make it finite. And I think it is interesting, especially for young artists or even artists starting something new in midlife, to remember, particularly, maybe this is something I think women in particular should think about. You can make it whatever scale you want it to be, and it still can be very beautiful and very impressive. It can be a quarterly series. It can be something that publishes once a year, and it can be whatever you want it to be and whatever you make it. So with Affero, no regrets. But I don't think we really quite understood that. I'd probably do it all the same. But I think there's great power in saying we can limit this thing, and we can have it assume the shape and form that not only that we need it to be based on the resources that we have to give it, but you know, there might be kind of beauty in saying this is a limited run. This is something as idiosyncratic and specific as we want it to be. You know, it can be a 2-page zine and we call it a publication, or it can be, you know, a 100-page tome that comes out every 3 years. You get the idea. So those are probably my only other 2 sort of pointers, you know, for creative people living dangerously.
Wonderful. Yes, and I can see why this is such a good fit for you with your approach to abundance. So there's so much that Gallery Aferro has to offer. I hope folks that are on the call and watch this recording visit the website and engage somehow with Gallery Aferro. Thank you so much, Emma. I want to be respectful of time. We're a couple minutes over, so we'll do a little wrap up. I want to share the final screen and let folks know that a recording will be made available and a link will be sent out. And yeah, we look forward to maybe conversations in the future, Emma. This was fantastic.
Likewise. Send us emails, send us questions, send us your thoughts, and you can now safely visit the gallery if you want to in Newark or at affero.org. But to everyone on the call, thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks.
night.
Good night.
Night. Thank you, Emma.